The badge scanner beeped red twice before it finally let Cole Merritt through the turnstile. 7:14 a.m., 14 minutes late. By the time he reached the warehouse floor, his supervisor was already standing there with a clipboard and a face that had clearly rehearsed what came next. "Ms. Ashworth wants you in her office. Now." Cole didn't argue. He never did. He walked past 40 sets of eyes that suddenly found their forklifts very interesting. Up 2 flights of stairs he'd climbed 1,000 times, and into a glass office that smelled like coffee and cold decisions. 10 minutes later, he was carrying a cardboard box past the same 40 sets of eyes, and none of them knew that 2 hours earlier, he had pulled a 6-year-old boy out of a stalled car on train tracks. Stay with me, because this one gets worse before it gets better, and the ending is not what you think. If you believe good people sometimes get punished before anyone learns the truth, like, comment, and subscribe to Kindness Corner 2.0. You'll want to see how this one ends. Let's rewind. Because to understand how a 14-minute delay nearly cost a man everything, you have to understand what his mornings actually looked like before this one went sideways. 3 years earlier, Cole Merritt had been a different kind of tired. Not the tired that comes from working too hard. The tired that comes from losing someone. His wife, Dana, died in a car accident on a wet October night, the same week their son Theo turned 4. Cole remembered almost nothing from the funeral except that Theo kept asking when Mommy was coming back from her trip. He didn't have the words yet to explain that some trips don't end. For months afterward, Cole functioned on the kind of autopilot that grief runs on. He went to work, came home, made dinner, put Theo to bed, and sat alone in the kitchen afterward, not really thinking about anything, just letting the silence exist around him because it was easier than filling it. His old sales job had paid well, but it had also meant unpredictable travel, late nights closing deals, dinners he sometimes missed entirely. That kind of schedule worked fine when there were 2 parents splitting the load. It didn't work with one. He quit within a month. Everyone told him he was crazy to walk away from commission money with a kid to raise alone. He didn't disagree. He just needed something with a fixed start time and a fixed end time, something boring in the best possible way. Something he could build a life around without it collapsing the moment he wasn't looking. Howarth Logistics was hiring warehouse associates, not glamorous. Not what his old co-workers would call a step up, but steady, with benefits after 90 days and a facility 11 minutes from Theo's new elementary school. Cole took it without hesitating. For 3 years, his mornings ran like a train schedule. Alarm at 5:45, lunch packed at 6 C's, Theo dressed, fed, backpack checked for whatever permission slip needed signing that week. Drop off at the sitters by 6:45. Clock in before 7 and be cheer. Leave at exactly 3:30, no exceptions, so he could be standing at the school gate before the doors even opened. Not once late. Not once absent. Not once did he ask a supervisor for a favor, or an extension, or a shortcut. 3 years of that, quietly, without anyone thanking him for it. Because showing up on time isn't the kind of thing that earns applause. It's just the kind of thing that's supposed to happen, which is exactly why what happened next should never have happened at all. Now here's where it gets interesting. Because 2 weeks before Cole's badge scanned red, a decision got made 3 floors above him that had nothing to do with him, and everything to do with what came next. Howarth's biggest client, a grocery chain called Bellcrest Markets, had threatened to walk over a string of missed delivery windows. The new CEO, a 34-year-old named Vivian Ashworth who'd inherited the company 8 months earlier when her father died suddenly at his desk, was still learning the difference between running a company and pretending she already knew how. She'd spent those 8 months proving herself in 100 small ways. Nobody applauded either. Memorizing route names she'd never personally driven, learning to read a shipping manifest the way her father once had, sitting through board meetings where half the room still glanced toward her father's old chair out of habit, before remembering it was hers now. It hadn't been easy. It also hadn't been optional. Her operations director, a sharp-tongued man named Grant Pallister who'd been with the company 11 years, walked into her office with a plan. Zero-tolerance attendance policy. Any unexcused tardiness past 10 minutes, instant termination. No warnings. No exceptions. Vivian didn't love it. It felt less like solving a problem and more like performing one for an audience that hadn't asked to watch. She signed it anyway, because 8 months into a job she still barely understood, she had learned to borrow confidence from people who seemed to have more of it than she did. Brandt had been running operations since before she could legally drive a forklift. It was easier to trust him than to double-check him. Here's the thing nobody in that boardroom said out loud, the thing that will matter enormously in about 10 minutes of story time. Belcrest never actually asked for a zero-tolerance policy. Brandt added that part himself, quietly, in a single sentence buried in a much longer memo Vivian skimmed between two other meetings. Why would an operations director build a policy harsher than the client even wanted? Hold that question. It's about to matter more than you think. 9 days later, the policy caught its first person, and it happened because of something nobody could have scripted. That morning, Cole's truck rattled over the same railroad crossing it always did, 2 blocks from the sitter's house. Except this time, the crossing arms were down, and a sedan sat stalled directly on the tracks. Not idling. Stopped. Hazards blinking weakly, the driver slumped over the wheel. Cole didn't think. He threw the truck into park, told Theo to stay buckled, and ran. The driver was an elderly woman, unresponsive, maybe mid-seizure, her foot locked against the brake. The crossing lights kept flashing. Somewhere down the track, a horn sounded, low, then not low at all. The car door was jammed. Cole braced one foot against the frame and pulled until something in his shoulder screamed, and it finally gave way. He dragged the woman clear. Then he saw the second passenger. A boy, maybe 6 years old, crying, buckled into a booster seat too small to unfasten himself in the back seat of a car sitting on active train tracks, with a horn getting louder by the second. This is the part where most people would say there wasn't time. Cole didn't check the math. There wasn't room in his head for math, only for the sound of a horn getting louder, and a boy screaming a word that might have been help, or might have just been noise shaped like fear. He reached back in, tore the booster buckle free with hands that weren't shaking yet but would be later, and pulled the boy out just as the train's lights swept across the intersection, close enough now that the gravel under Cole's boots seemed to hum with it. He didn't run in a straight line away from the car. He remembers that part clearly, later, when he replays it at 3 a.m. for reasons he can't fully explain to himself. He ran diagonally, angling both of them away from the tracks and away from the car in the same motion, because some part of his brain that wasn't thinking in words at all had already calculated the blast radius of a train hitting a stalled sedan and decided diagonal was safer than straight. They cleared the tracks by 4 seconds. 4. The train didn't hit the car. It came close enough to knock Cole's cap into a ditch, close enough that the wind of it staggered him half a step sideways with the boy still locked against his chest. But it missed. The horn screamed past them and kept going, fading down the line the way ordinary trains do on ordinary mornings, as if it hadn't just come within 4 seconds of ending 2 lives on its way to a freight yard nobody in that intersection would ever think about again. Cole sat on the gravel shoulder with a crying 6-year-old in his lap, an unconscious woman beside him, and a son watching the entire thing through a windshield. And for one long second, none of it felt real. Then it got very real, very fast, because his shift had already started 9 minutes ago. He called 911, stayed until paramedics arrived, gave a statement to an officer whose notepad was still shaking slightly in the cold, made sure the boy was wrapped in a blanket and handed off to an aunt who arrived white-faced 12 minutes later. By the time Cole climbed back into his truck, it was 7,009. He dropped Theo off, apologized for the delay, and drove to work with hands that hadn't quite stopped trembling. He walked in at 7:14, 14 minutes late. No call, no warning on paper. Just a badge scan that read red and a story nobody had asked him to tell yet. Here's where it gets brutal. Because the person who fired him never even asked what happened. Grant Pallister was waiting on the floor. "You're late," he said. "Not a question. Something happened on my way in. Save it for the office. Ms. Ashworth wants to see you." Cole didn't know yet how fast this had already traveled up the chain. Grant had been flagging every tardiness violation straight to Vivian's inbox all week, eager to prove the new policy had teeth. And Vivian, buried in a 9 o'clock call with Belcrest's regional buyer, glanced at her phone between sentences, and approved the termination in under a minute. 40 seconds. That's how long it took to end 3 years of perfect attendance. By the time Cole reached her office, the decision had already been made without him in the room. "Mr. Merritt, you're aware of the attendance policy." "I am." "You were 14 minutes late, with no notice. There was an accident on my route. A car stalled on the tracks. I stopped to help." Watch her face here, because this is the moment that will haunt her later. It flickered, just slightly, the way a face moves when someone's deciding whether to believe something inconvenient. "I appreciate you telling me that," she said. "But I don't have a way to verify it, and the policy doesn't have an exception clause. I have to let you go." Cole didn't argue. He'd learned, in 3 years, which rooms were worth fighting in. "Okay," he said. "Can I clean out my locker?" He thanked her for 3 years of employment on his way out. That single sentence would sit in Vivian's chest for the next 24 hours, like a stone she couldn't put down. She didn't know it yet, but she was about to find out exactly who she fired, and exactly what he'd done 2 hours before she signed his termination. Now here's the twist that changes everything. And I promise, you did not see this coming. Vivian had been at a construction site that morning, phone off, unreachable for 3 hours, which is why she wasn't the one who took Simon to his checkup. Her sister Renata was taking a shortcut across an old railroad crossing Vivian herself normally avoided. Vivian turned her phone back on at 11:40 to 14 missed calls and a text that read, "Simon is okay, call me." Simon, her 6-year-old son. She called back standing in a gravel parking lot and listened to her sister describe a stalled car, a seizure, a train horn, and a stranger in a gray work jacket who tore a locked booster seat open 4 seconds before impact. "Do you have his name?" Vivian asked, her voice already unsteady. "I didn't get it, Viv. I wasn't thinking about names. I was thinking about Simon." Vivian pulled the police incident report an hour later. Read it once. Read it twice. Certain she'd misread it. She hadn't. Witness, Tharst responder, Cole Merritt, employee, Halworth Logistics. The man she fired at 7020 that morning for being 14 minutes late at 6:52, pulled her son out of a car 4 seconds before a freight train tore through the intersection. She sat at her desk for a long time. Grant knocked twice about a shipping schedule. She didn't answer either time. She kept replaying his exact words. "There was an accident on my route. I stopped to help." She'd told him she couldn't verify it. She'd fired him anyway. You'd think that's the low point of this story. It's not. Because the next morning, Vivian found out the policy that cost Cole his job was never really about Bellcrest at all. She didn't sleep. At 6 a.m., she called Grant directly. Pull everything on Cole Merritt's termination. Every document, every timestamp. By 8 a.m., she had the file spread across her desk. 3 years. 0 unexcused absences. Reviews calling him the kind of employee you build a shift around. And, underneath all of it, the termination approved in under a minute on a policy with no exception clause that Grant had personally insisted on. She called him in. Whose idea was zero tolerance, specifically the no exceptions part? Mine. Bellcrest wanted. Did Bellcrest ask for 0 exceptions, or did you decide that yourself? He hesitated. Just slightly. The way people hesitate when a question lands somewhere they didn't prepare for. I decided that part. It's cleaner. Cleaner for who? He didn't answer that one. Vivian already had the real Bellcrest correspondence pulled, not Grant's summary. The client's actual concern was about delivery windows, a scheduling issue, nothing to do with individual attendance. Grant had taken a vague client note and built an ironclad system around it, rigid enough to quietly catch an employee he'd wanted gone for months. The reason went back 3 months earlier, when Cole flagged a faulty conveyor sensor on the loading dock that Grant wanted patched instead of properly repaired, because a proper repair meant a 2-day delay on a shipment schedule. Grant had already promised was untouchable. Cole didn't argue with Grant directly. He simply went over his head to safety compliance, filed the report through the standard channel exactly the way protocol required, and the sensor got fixed, the slow, correct way instead of the fast, convenient one. Grant never forgot it. A man who quietly proves you wrong once and turns out to be right has a way of becoming a problem You start looking for excuses to solve. The zero-tolerance policy was never about Bellcrest. It was a trap built for one specific person, wrapped in language about client confidence so nobody would think to ask why. You used my biggest client as cover to settle a personal score, Vivian said quietly. And I signed off on it in under a minute because I trusted you more than I checked the facts. So now the real question, what does she do with that? She got Cole's address that same afternoon. He was in the garage replacing a bicycle chain when the charcoal sedan pulled up, Theo narrating the whole repair like a shop foreman. Ms. Mayesten, Ashworth, Mr. Merritt. She looked considerably less composed than she had behind her glass desk. I need to apologize to you properly. I need about 10 minutes, if you have them. The boy you pulled off the tracks yesterday, she said. That was my son, Simon. Cole went still. I didn't know that, he said. I didn't ask his name, I know. I read the report. I know exactly what you did, and exactly how little I asked before I ended your job over 14 minutes. I never bothered to investigate. Her voice caught, and she let it. You told me why you were late. I told you I couldn't verify it. I let you walk out anyway. I've spent 24 hours looking for a version of that decision that doesn't make me someone you shouldn't have to work for. I don't have one. Theo looked up at her. Are you the lady from the tracks? No, sweetheart. My son was the boy in the car. Your dad saved him. He's good at fixing things, Theo said solemnly. He fixed the door lock last week, too. I believe that, Vivian said, and meant it more than most sentences she'd spoken all year. Word had already moved through the warehouse floor by the time Vivian left her office that afternoon, the way word always does in a building full of people with nothing to do at lunch but talk. Half the floor had heard that Cole Merritt, quiet, punctual, 3 years without so much as a sick day, had been walked out over 14 minutes. Nobody knew why he'd been late. Cole wasn't the type to explain himself to people who hadn't asked directly. And in the confusion of clearing out his locker, nobody had thought to ask. One of the younger associates, a kid named Marcus whom Cole had trained 8 months earlier, told his supervisor flatly that the whole thing felt wrong, though he couldn't quite say why. Only that firing the one guy who never needed watching felt like punishing the wrong person for something. Nobody argued with him. Nobody did anything about it either. That's usually how it goes, right up until someone with the actual power to fix it finds out the truth for herself. She turned back to Cole. I want to offer you your job back. Not the same one. I went through your file this morning. You've been doing work 2 levels above your title for 2 years, catching safety issues nobody else caught, training hires nobody assigned you. I want to offer you safety and compliance coordinator, reporting directly to me. And I want to rewrite the policy that let this happen so it never happens to anyone else, for any reason, again. Cole didn't answer right away. He wiped grease from his hands, buying himself a second. I need to know something first, he said. Would you be offering any of this if Simon hadn't been in that car? Here's the answer that decided everything. No, Vivian said, not flinching from it. I'd owe you an apology either way, because I was wrong regardless of whose son it was. But I won't pretend the job offer exists without Simon in it. You deserve the truth more than you deserve a nicer-sounding lie. That answer landed harder than any apology dressed up in softer words could have. Okay, Cole said. I'll take the job. Not because of Simon. Because you just told me the truth when the easy thing would have been to make it prettier. Vivian exhaled something that had been sitting in her chest since 11:40 the day before. You'd think that's the ending. It's not quite. There's one more piece still missing, and it's the part that makes this story actually satisfying. Brant Pallister was gone within the week. Once finance quietly confirmed what Vivian already suspected, he'd spent the better part of a year steering safety shortcuts past inspection, protecting margins on paper, while creating exactly the kind of risk that had nearly killed a 6-year-old on train tracks 2 blocks from an elementary school. His severance was handled quietly, through legal channels, with no headline attached. The kind of ending that mattered enormously to the people inside it and barely registered anywhere else. The zero-tolerance policy got rewritten within a month, with an actual exception clause this time, one that required a human being to ask a single follow-up question before ending someone's job over a number on a clock. Vivian sat through the drafting sessions herself, line by line, something she hadn't bothered to do the first time around. Cole started his new role the following Monday, Director of Safety and Compliance, reporting straight to Vivian instead of through the operations chain that had nearly buried him. He kept his 3:30 pickup non-negotiable and wrote it into his own onboarding paperwork himself, in the blank space marked additional notes, the way he'd have written it, whether anyone approved or not. Vivian didn't blink. She signed it without needing to think about it, and meant that too. A few weeks later, Simon started asking if the truck guy could come to his birthday party. Cole came. Theo came with him, and spent the whole afternoon debating whether a stegosaurus could beat a triceratops with a 6-year-old, who considered the matter extremely serious business. Vivian watched the two boys from across the yard, half listening to a conversation about dinosaur teeth, and thought about how differently that afternoon could have gone if 4 seconds had landed the other way. Cole and Vivian started running into each other more than the job strictly required. Safety reviews mostly. Occasionally a lunch neither of them had planned that stretched longer than either expected. Theo started asking, casually, whether Simon would be at the next thing, whatever the next thing happened to be, and Cole stopped pretending the question needed correcting. Nobody made an announcement about any of it. It simply accumulated, the way trust does when it isn't rushed, one Saturday, and then another, until the accumulation was just the shape of how their family spent time now, and neither of them could point to the exact afternoon it had started. Vivian stood at the edge of that first birthday party, though, watching two boys argue happily, thinking about how close this entire story had come to going the other way, how a policy built to protect a company's reputation had nearly cost her the one person whose safety outweighed every client relationship she owned, and how the man who saved her son had spent 3 quiet years being exactly the kind of employee every company claims to want and almost never notices until it's nearly too late. She never told the board the full story behind Grant's exit. Some things don't need to become company history to matter. But she kept a note on her desk after that, handwritten, tucked under the corner of her keyboard where she'd see it every single morning before opening her inbox. Ask before you assume. Not a policy. Didn't need to be. Just the one thing she'd learned cost nothing to practice and everything to ignore. So here's what this story actually comes down to. A policy can measure minutes. It cannot measure character. It cannot measure a stalled car on a set of train tracks, or the 4 seconds between a horn getting louder and a boy getting pulled clear of it. It can only measure a number on a clock and hand out consequences based on that number alone, without ever asking what that number cost someone to arrive at. And sometimes the 14 minutes that cost a good man his job are the exact same 14 minutes that saved the child's life. Proof that the value of a person was never really about the clock to begin with, and never should have been. Comment kindness still exists if you believe one good act, even one nobody witnesses, still finds its way back to the person who gave it. And if this story got you, even a little, share it with someone who still believes kindness matters. Because the next time you see someone judged for showing up late, remember Cole Merritt and ask before you assume.